Let me mention one other thing that I think is very important to this state. This is getting back to some issues. Tourism is the greatest opportunity to get good revenue in Alabama that we have. It's a clean industry, and we have every attraction that a state could ask for in Alabama for tourists. We have great state parks. We have a mountainous region. We have the Gulf coastal region. We have inland lakes. We have everything. And I think that this is an area that can mean an awful lot to Alabama. And at the same time as we bring these people into the state, they will see us and understand us and see what a great state we have. And I don't want to run for another office. You know, I just want to be governor. I don't want to be senator. I don't want to be president. I don't want to be any of those things. I want to be governor, and that's all. And I'll make a good one, too.
Jefferson Blunt St. Clair has never been brought to the attention of this court, even though it says that it realizes their county line problems. We have no racial problem. We have no one-man, one-vote problem. We have none of the other problems. This is a pure gerrymandering question.
But the legislature's attorney, Dave Boyd, said if the Jefferson County Court goes ahead with its hearings, that court could issue some ruling that would create election confusion over the legislative districts in that area. Mr. Blanton argued back the state court proceedings might raise questions helpful to the federal court's work. But the three-judge federal panel indicated it wanted to find some middle ground between Mr. Boyd's request to stop the state court hearings.
Perhaps I misunderstood him.
Go ahead.
I think what he was doing, and I may be entirely incorrect, but I thought that he wanted, there's opinion of the court, that the proceeding should go on, but he wanted some way that that decision would not interfere with the interim plan.
I think the court is sympathetic to the possibility of a problem and wants to avoid the problem, and if it's by way of a device short of an injunction, I think the court will find it appropriate to clear up the possibility of any confusion.
The three-judge federal panel didn't indicate when it would rule, but it's expected to come before the Jefferson County Court holds its next hearing on August 23rd. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the federal courthouse.
Governor James?
Aye.
Before I'm hit, I need to have a little back expenditure. The purpose of this resolution today is to approve several renovations and temporary facilities.
Now let's go to the Heritage Trust Fund, let's go to corrections, you know, let's read.
I think we all do, but I think it ought to come before.
Representative Buskey?
Aye.
Representative Moore?
Because it's obvious when you read last Sunday's paper. The reporter who wrote this article about me also wrote an adjacent article where he talked about my opponent, Billy Joe Camp, the president of the Public Service Commission. And
now, those situations, the interest rates coming down and getting people back to work have got to be corrected. No, I haven't, but I may very well be. Not, but I was told by some people I've been told by members of the home building industry who know their business. This $24-25 million could have resulted in hundreds of Alabamians going back to work with good, meaningful, and productive jobs. Not to mention the fact that the end result would have provided some housing that is in critical need and some housing that would be better than what many of our families are in today. So I think that this is an opportunity at those farms. Offices, figures. For every 1% increase in unemployment in this country.
of it, use the interest off of it in the manner that we're speaking of here today.
How much money are we talking about?
It's got cracks around the doors and around the windows and so forth. Their power bill is going to exceed the $700 Lifeline program, which here again, let me give you an example. It's a little out of line on the top end, and I do have those figures. I had rather, and being on the commission, I think the greatest problem we have, certainly the greatest problem we hear of daily, are those folks that are on the lower end, those folks with a small.
Along, you would really have two different standards applied to state employees. In this case, those on the general fund would be asked to make a sacrifice along with every non-merit system employee and the governor's staff and the cabinet members, whereas those on earmarked funds would probably not be affected. So one of the things that we would seriously consider is how do you even-handedly apply such a drastic measure as this? The original intent of the governor's proposal was to unearmark not only
to help us solve problems as opposed to merely exploiting them for political advantage. To me, that's the number one issue in the 1982. Now, you might have expected that I would say something more specific, such as jobs or crime or public education. And I consider all of these to be issues, but they are issues that cannot be solved unless we first concentrate on the human talents, on the values of those people who aspire to hold this most important office.
What are your qualifications? What qualities would you bring to the governor's office?
I think it's probably the first time in the history of this state that a gubernatorial candidate actually had for everyone to consider in advance of voting what it is that he promises to do during the next 4 years, and to have those promises be the same no matter whether they're mentioned in Montgomery, in Greenville, in Dothan, in Ozark, in Headland. Because I think that for too long we've had people try to get elected to this office by pitting one segment of Alabamians against another, by exploiting one popular political whipping boy, or by going into each city in this state and promising them everything they wish to hear, knowing that it was a financial impossibility to deliver.
The trip we're going on to Montreal is the DCI prelims and finals. We will participate in the prelims, and then the top 12 corps go back on the night of the 21st and participate in finals. It's the end of the season. That's where you do receive your international ranking for the whole year.
Is this something special?
Yes, it's very special to us because our goal this year is to get into the top 25, which is considered the associate corps, and that's really important to us.
content of subjects. The proposed site that we're talking about is just a very few miles. It's almost on the banks of the Alabama River. My prediction is that if these dumps are established and filled with these lakes of poisonous waste, there will not be one living organism in the Alabama River within 10 years. The only thing that I can say is that it can bring out, too. It ties in with this that I failed to bring out. This has nothing whatever to do with our existing industries that we have now or have proposed.
This morning requesting that he include in his call to the special session of the legislature next week a plan by which the state of Alabama think that, strange things happen during the election percent in support of the program. We have talked to certain people at Pensions and Security, so everything is already in motion. We just don't have to, as I said earlier, start another bureaucratic program, and I would be opposed to doing that on industry. And with the unemployment rate in Alabama like we have today, we're concerned about different places in the state of Alabama, and right now I could think of no better place than to use a little of it, use the interest off of it in the manner that we're speaking of here today.
How much money are we talking about?
Well, the federal program spends $16 million in Alabama.
The attempts of some individuals to make light use of civil rights statutes in order to advance the claims of people who have a stake in the prerogatives of being white. It means that such people will, I think, begin to take a second look and make certain that they understand what the whole basis of discrimination cases has been about historically and what it's about now.
For which there is no cause. And the second one is no man is above the law. Somewhere during your education experience, and to tell you that these three things have meant a great deal to me. And when we recognize this in our lives.
Carl Jackson, cum laude. Kieran Alice Keller, magna cum laude. Walter Marty King, Jr., summa cum laude. Barbara Lundstrom Plummeyer, cum laude. Lois Darrell Russell, cum laude. Mike.
Your federal government defaulted on one of their primary missions. A stable currency on one hand, defend the country on the other. Everything else was left to your legislature.
New federalism is only one of the topics the governor covered in his speech, but it was the topic that brought Alabama black mayors to Tuskegee. Mayor Johnny Ford of Tuskegee, who also serves as president of the Alabama Conference of Black Mayors, says this year's convention is designed to prepare black mayors for the new federalism program. Mayor Ford says under the Reagan administration's plan to turn more federally run programs over to the states, Alabama black mayors must know what they're facing.
We're concerned that the new federalism ought to address equal opportunity, affirmative action to make sure that minorities and the problems affecting minority blacks and whites in this state, their concerns and their problems, and make sure that they are addressed adequately.
The conference also gave black mayors a chance to hear from several gubernatorial candidates. Mayor Ford says the conference will not endorse a candidate until the Alabama Democratic Conference meets in Montgomery later this month. Reporting from Tuskegee, Don Phelps, WSFA TV News.
Dr. Rayner says state employee furloughs is one of 4 options being considered, and hopefully the last option chosen.
We find that so distasteful that we don't even want to do any formal planning on it until 2 things occur.
That includes what he calls some miracle to change the financial outlook of the general fund, or the legislature coming up with some effort to help out. The finance director says the legislature could unearmark more than $500 million in non-education taxes, opening the way to shift money around to help the general fund. And Dr. Rayner says the legislature could pass Governor James' retirement reform package, creating an estimated $40 million in savings that could be used. But Dr. Rayner says the administration is also considering leasing more offshore oil tracts, hoping to get as much as $30 million in bids.
I suspect that we're a little bit late for unearmarking. I suspect that we're a little bit late for the retirement bill for this fiscal year, the effects of it. Now we're down, unless some miracle happens, we're down to two possibilities that we've identified so far. Sell another oil and gas lease, or drastically reduce state personnel, equipment, parking, so forth. Of the two, I would hope that the oil and sale of an oil and gas lease would be the first thing we do.
And Dr. Rayner says not only will one of the options be necessary to save the general fund this year, but also to keep next year's general fund budget from automatically going into proration in October.
We feel like we've done just about everything short of some what we would consider very drastic measures.
Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Whether or not the legislature will ever unearmark or not, I don't know.
Will it be like a part of your 6 o'clock news where you'll just do a profile of our society? As Lieutenant Governor, I have done this. In fact, one reason that my name may not be a household word in Alabama is, to me, a compliment to my record as Lieutenant Governor, because I've worked to bring cooperation, not controversy, to the Alabama Senate, peace, not division. And that doesn't make 6 o'clock television broadcast. It does not make newspaper headlines. But it does enable us as Alabamians to make progress. And it's the same way I would approach the responsibilities of the governorship of this state, who can help Alabama move forward in a substantive way. We've got 18 years left in this century. And if Alabama, I personally think that it was unthinkable to have allowed a situation to exist in which a federal judge would turn loose several hundred inmates due to an overcrowded condition. But while I may disagree with his judgment, I likewise strongly, personally resent the vacuum of leadership over a long time period. And I'm not talking about Governor James, because he was one who was willing to step forward and to be a receiver of the state's prison system.
Saturday morning, we're sending all the kids out. They're going to have little buckets in their hands or hats or something. I don't know what. But we're going to go door to door asking for donations from people. It takes us about $100,000 a year to operate, which we solely raise completely on our own right now. We're looking for some sponsors, but we don't have them yet. But we're sending them door to door asking for donations from the citizens of Montgomery.
This particular time, we're going to ask our own. First, I want to get me a glass of water.
Integrity. Somehow have a greater sense of how can a striped suit politician in Montgomery, Alabama come talking to you about being interested in education when all they're doing down there the last 9 months is trying to gut the revenue for local schools and cities and governments. What about that? Now that is an issue. Ask those running for office. When you ask them, they got to look them right in the eye. Because most politicians can't look you in the eye very long.
About 75 people started a mile-long walk from the Edmund Pettus Bridge to the historic Brown Chapel AME Church. But about 25 onlookers joined the march through downtown streets. Others just watched with curiosity. The march took place in Selma because of the city's alarmingly high crime rate. According to the Alabama Criminal Justice Information Center, Selma had the highest per capita crime rate of any Alabama city in 1981. March organizer, the Reverend Joseph Lambert, says black leaders are particularly concerned about black-on-black crime.
And our theme is to not turn on each other, but to turn to each other. And let's get together and see what we can do in the name of brotherhood to try to effect some kind of positive changes for those people who are denied, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in this country.
As if to illustrate the point of the march, one pastor said he was unable to bring a busload of people from the Beloit community to the march. The windows to the bus had been smashed by vandals. Susan Silvernail reporting from Selma for WSFA TV News.
The incident took place in the 4000 block of South Wells Street. Early reports, thus far unconfirmed, indicated that a witness told police he saw a woman walking down the street one minute and that she was on fire the next. She fell to the ground, a mass of flames. The body was taken to the emergency room at Mercy Hospital. Dr. David Howes pronounced the woman, who remains unidentified, dead on arrival.
And there was so much soot deposited throughout the body that it was difficult to determine any specific characteristics of race as an example. There were demonstrable areas of first and second degree and third degree burning with charring of the chest and abdominal areas. It appeared that most of the body, at least at some point during this occurrence or phenomenon, whatever, had been engulfed in flames.
Pending the results of an autopsy scheduled for tomorrow, no one can say whether the fiery death was due to foul play, did the woman set herself on fire, or a more bizarre possibility, was she the victim of spontaneous human combustion? Which means, did her body simply burst into flames? Reported cases of spontaneous human combustion have appeared in the medical literature for more than a century, and investigators of unusual phenomenon claim at least 300 documented cases have occurred, mainly in Great Britain and the U.S. A thread running through all the cases is the almost total destruction of the body.
Well, if you choose to believe the literature, and there are a number of well-documented cases, I think you have to assume that this has happened and just end up with saying that we really don't know why, we don't understand it, we haven't seen enough cases of it, but it probably does occur.
It really made no sense to begin with that anyone who had been white and dean of a school at Tuskegee for 21 years, that all of a sudden Tuskegee would fire him. That's obvious. Nonsense, as has turned out to be the case in the view of the court. In point of fact, what happened, he rejected the salary offer, a final salary offer, and wanted to claim that because his terms were not met, that somehow Tuskegee had an obligation to maintain him in the deanship.
Dr. Rayner says the state's general fund has been severely drained by unbudgeted appropriations from the legislature and lower than expected tax collections.
We feel like we've done just about everything short of some what we would consider very drastic measures.
The drastic measures include possibly laying off employees in order to save money. Dr. Rayner says a less distasteful option would be to lease more offshore oil tracts in hopes of receiving as much as $30 million in bids.
Of the two, I would hope that the oil and sale of an oil and gas lease would be the first thing we do.
The finance director also suggested the legislature consider unearmarking most non-education dollars, giving the administration more flexibility in shifting dollars. And Dr. Rayner said the legislature could pass Governor James' retirement reform measure, saving an estimated $40 million a year. He said he'd like to see the reforms passed in next week's special session.
I suspect that we're a little bit late for unearmarking. I suspect that we're a little bit late for the retirement bill for this fiscal year, the effects of it.
But he said the reforms would help prevent a similar situation from happening next year. Dr. Rayner says the situation is so serious this year, it could cause the general fund to begin its fiscal year in October already in proration. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
It was scoreless until the Atlanta 11th. After a walk to pitcher Pascual Perez, Claudel Washington tagged Valenzuela for a two-run homer, and it was 2-0. In the Atlanta 6th inning, Valenzuela pitching to Atlanta's Bob Horner. A smash came off the left knee of the Dodger left-hander. He went down. He was not seriously hurt, just a bruise. Came out of the ballgame on his own power. Should not miss his next turn. In the Dodgers 6th, sack single, moved around to third on a throwing error, scored on Dusty Baker's sacrifice fly. It was 2-1 Atlanta. In the Dodger 9th, with 2 out and runner at third base, pinch hitter Rick Monday grounded one through the legs of second baseman Jerry Royster. The tying run scored, and it was 2-2. In the Dodger 10th, Steve Sachs single to right. Went to second when outfielder Claudel Washington kicked the ball. Couple of intentional walks, loaded up the bases with 1 out. Ron Say came to the plate, hit a 1-out sacrifice fly to Dale Murphy in center field. Sachs tagged up, scored the winning run. Dodgers won it 3-2 in 10. Now trail Atlanta by 4.5. They made up 6 games in the Braves in the last 7 days.
Tonight, I'd like to introduce you to one of the most successful vote getters Montgomery has produced in years. Listen to these numbers. In his first race for public office 8 years ago against a strong opponent, he polled a whopping 73% of the vote. 4 years later, again with a strong challenger, he won re-election with an astounding 83% of the vote. And this fall, he will poll 100% of the vote in his race for a third term in office because nobody dared to run against him. Who is this man? His name is Alvin Holmes, state representative. And whatever you might say about him, he's a very interesting person. Let's tell it like it is. Alvin Holmes is not what you would call a low-profile legislator. His middle name is Controversy. He is perhaps the most discussed and cussed member of the Alabama legislature. He wouldn't have it any other way. But as far as his constituents and House District 80 are concerned, he is the people's choice. Overwhelmingly so. Alvin Holmes was born 42 years ago in rural Montgomery County, one of 13 children. He was graduated from Old Georgia Washington High School and later earned a bachelor's and master's degree from Alabama State University. As a student at ASU, Holmes was a very visible and active civil rights worker and was one of 30 students arrested in the late 1950s for staging a sit-in at the segregated lunchroom in the courthouse. Holmes served 2 years in the Army during the mid-1960s, then returned to Montgomery where he taught school for a while, worked for the Alabama State Teachers Association, later worked for the Alabama Democratic Conference. It was in 1974 that Holmes entered politics. The federal courts had reapportioned the legislative districts in a manner to ensure black representation. The legislature hasn't been quite the same since Holmes arrived. One of his first moves was to demand that the Confederate flag flying from the dome of the Capitol be taken down and be replaced by the American flag, which at that time flew on a pole on the South Lawn. That dispute was finally settled with a compromise. The Stars and Stripes now flies from the Capitol Dome, but so does the Stars and Bars. Holmes is especially proud that he succeeded in having I-85 in Montgomery named the Martin Luther King Expressway. And he's also convinced that his agitation and his pressure has resulted in a sharp increase in the number of black state employees. Holmes' role in the civil rights movement has brought him in contact with many national figures: Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, Mrs. Coretta King. Holmes, who is now in the real estate business, was married in the early 1960s, but the marriage ended in divorce. He has one daughter, Veronica, who attends Robert E. Lee High School. Does it bother Alvin Holmes that his daughter attends a school named for a Confederate general? His response: it could have been Jefferson Davis High School. Alvin Holmes, a very interesting person.
At the time that I was approaching the target, I was culminating about 10 and a half months of hard work. And truthfully, my only concern at that particular point was, is everything going the way it's supposed to go? Have I made a mistake? Have I done what's to be done? And then the question is, will this thing really work? I was confident that it would, but, you know, I didn't have a written guarantee. So those were the things that were going on through my mind. Later on, after you had time to, you know, reflect on the matter and look at it, I just reinforced my pre-bombing ideas, which were that the use of the weapon would destroy a large portion of any city. It would kill a lot of people. There was no question about that. But the object was to bring the war to a halt, and I was convinced going in that that's what it would do. When I saw the results of Hiroshima, there was no doubt in my mind. I knew that there was nobody, even as fanatical as the Japanese were at that time, I knew they couldn't stand up and would not stand up to multiple use of those weapons.
We're going to take it to federal court. We're going to take it to the appellate court. We're going to take it to the Supreme Court, and I believe for the first time we'll have the full force of the U.S. Department of Justice and the White House behind us. It ought to make a difference.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
There were 235 atmospheric nuclear tests conducted by the United States government from 1946 to 1962. An estimated 250,000 servicemen participated in the tests. From among their ranks, a disproportionate number today are complaining that various chronic illnesses, such as cancer and leukemia, were caused by exposure to low-level radiation encountered during the testing. The tests were conducted primarily here in the Nevada desert and in the two atolls of Bikini and Eniwetok in the South Pacific. Remember, it was the height of the Cold War. The Atomic Energy Commission wanted to learn how to build a better bomb. The Defense Department wanted to learn how soldiers performed after the detonation of a nuclear bomb.
Today, the big picture camera swings to the barren flats near Desert Rock, Nevada.
One central theme ran throughout every government film. The tests were safe. To provide an added sense of security for the troops, radiation-sensitive film badges, called dosimeters, were worn.
They have learned what exposure can do to an unprotected individual.
However, veterans say they weren't protected from radiation exposure. Today, they want the Veterans Administration to compensate them. But the government says no, that radiation levels among men witnessing the tests were too low to cause the health problems veterans are claiming. So in 96% of the cases, the VA has denied service-connected claims. Take the case of retired Master Sergeant Ted Krasguki of Las Vegas. In 1976, he developed cancer and his larynx was removed.
Well, I filed a claim for disability, and it was denied, so I appealed it. That was denied.
In Nevada, Krasguki participated in 22 tests. He had been a transportation sergeant. Says he got as close as several thousand yards to ground zero many times. Important to his disability claim are dosimeter records. They would show the level of radiation to which he was exposed. Ted, you have here radiation exposure history from the Department of Energy. What does it say about your exposure?
There is no dissimilar record for me.
In other words, what you're saying is they can't find any records on exposure.
It's simple to say records are lost or destroyed.
In Alexandria, Virginia, the Defense Nuclear Agency keeps check on the dosimeter records. Spokesman Colonel Dale Keller provides this explanation why Ted Przeguski's disability case is hard to prove.
Well, I think that's indicative of one of two things. Either the individual was not present at any of the test shots, in which case his records would indicate that. Or number two, his records may have been destroyed in a fire that took place at the Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri in 1973.
At VA headquarters in Washington, John Hagan, Deputy Benefits Director, says he can't explain why Przeguski's records are missing. How about the fire in St. Louis in 1973?
That had nothing to do with that because those are medical records and not radiation records. The Department of Defense maintains the records on radiation exposure.
For Przeguski, the contradiction leaves him frustrated and skeptical.
They either intentionally withheld the information or deliberately told us a big fat lie.
If Ted Przeguski feels betrayed, so do many other atomic veterans. Thousands are fighting a losing battle with the government to have their illnesses linked to radiation exposure. In 1957, Tom Saffer was a gung-ho 22-year-old Marine second lieutenant. Just out of Camp Pendleton, California, he was assigned to duty at the government's nuclear test site at Camp Desert Rock, Nevada. He never dared question or resist his superiors when he was ordered into a trench to witness the explosion of an atomic bomb just 1 mile away. He was told there'd be no danger.
We had our forearms covering our eyes. The minute that the bomb went off, the light was so bright, it allowed me to see the bones in my forearm. The next thing that occurred, the heat was so intense, it literally burned the hair on the back of my neck. When the shock wave hit the trench, I thought the end of the world had occurred, and I thought, my God, why am I here? I was frightened, extremely frightened.
Now, Tom Saffer believes he was right to be afraid. At Camp Desert Rock, his first time here since 1957, he says fallout from the bomb, 4 times more powerful than the one that Hiroshima, caused the deterioration of his health. Neuromuscular disorders no doctor seems able to diagnose.
We were taken down to within 300 yards of ground zero. We stood there dumbfounded. And then suddenly a man in a white suit with a hooded respirator ran up to us, came from somewhere, and he pointed at this instrument, meaning that the radioactive readings were high, waving his arm and saying, "Get out of here! Get out of here!" He was an Atomic Energy Commission field worker.
Saffer is full of questions. He wants to know why troops were marched into the blast areas with no protection from the irradiated dust. He wants to know why atomic veterans, like John Smitherman, who's dying of cancer, are denied service-connected disability benefits from the Veterans Administration.
I don't think that the Atomic Energy Commission lied to people.
If Saffer were to ask Department of Energy spokesman Dave Miller about the dangers to which he might have been exposed, he'd hear what he was told years ago.
The exposure levels are so low that you would not expect any injury or cancers or anything else 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years after the fact.
Defense Nuclear Agency spokesman Colonel Dale Keller would tell Saffer basically the same thing.
The troops were not put in a position where they were exposed to hazardous levels of radiation.
The fallacy in their reasoning is this. They knew that there would be injuries or could be injuries, but not one nickel, not 1 cent, not $1 was ever budgeted for treatment of victims. They have a moral responsibility to us because it was immoral to expose us to carcinogens when the effects were known. They were known by those who put us there, but they were not known by us who were there.
With questions raised about the safety of the nuclear power industry, with concern over radioactive substances in medical diagnosis and treatment, And with underground nuclear testing continuing in Nevada, the Department of Defense says medical decisions in favor of atomic veterans could damage the government's nuclear programs. So, it's reluctant to admit that tens of thousands of soldiers might have been exposed to unsafe levels of radiation.
If one church can do this, you know, it wouldn't take hardly anything to take care of all the needs, I think, in Montgomery of the elderly and the people who can't help themselves. Now,
just don't shake the thing, that's all I ask.
It was billed as the first annual invitational powerlifting meet. It was held at Kilby Correctional Facility and it drew a large and enthusiastic crowd.
Come on!
The lifters, all 50 of them, are state prison inmates. They came in teams representing 6 of the state's correctional centers to compete all day for medals, a trophy, and a new set of weights. The idea for bringing the inmates together for the contest came from an inmate, and one of the organizers of the program, an employee at Kilby, Lamar Parker, says he thinks the idea is a good one.
Sure. I think it's useful because it gives them all something to pull together for. You know, so many times we turn on the TV at 6 o'clock and see the negative things that's happening in the prison system. And this is giving us opportunity to do something positive.
The judges for the contest are lifters themselves on the outside, and they say competition here is strong.
It compares favorably with lifting that we've seen anywhere. Lifting is very high caliber, and in certain cases, as you know, world caliber.
Like 60-year-old inmate Harry Fisher, who was a winner today in the Masters competition with this lift, a 485 pounds. This thing is the state championship for the inmates, a finishing point for a lot of preparation. But state officials say as far as the contest itself, this may be only the beginning of a successful program. Reporting from Kilby Correctional Facility, Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News.
All right. Happy birthday.
Hey, give him a big hand, folks, because...
You're going to feed them all you got. This one. Look at him standing up.
Oh, that one. No.
When the Ethics Commission started its study about the 1982 candidates, Executive Director Melvin Cooper thought he'd find a large pool of teachers and lawyers. To be sure, many of the candidates do earn a living in education or the law, 30% in the House and 40% over in the Senate. But the rest of the candidates work in all kinds of jobs.
We have mail carriers, we have barbers, we have funeral directors, we have printers, we have fast food operators, insurance, hospital therapists.
So Cooper says there's a good chance that the new legislature will be fairly representative of the people of Alabama. More women are running for office, and the Republican Party is fielding more candidates. Of course, only about 2% of those seeking legislative seats are unemployed. To be truly representative, the figure should be closer to 14%. Susan Silvernail, WSFA TV News.
record for the number of home runs been hit by both teams in one game. The record is...
Delta 251, roger, wind is 360 at 7, clear to land, 27.
When airplanes come into Montgomery's Danley Field these days, the pilots may hear the voice of an air traffic controller.
Delta 251, turn right out of taxiway, ground 12149.
Or they may hear the voice of any one of the 11 controller trainees who work in the tower.
The strike, of course, was, the walkout was August 3rd, and I made inquiries about October and got hired in January.
Don Holt is one of those trainees. For him and many of his co-workers, the controller's walkout and firing meant an opportunity.
I had wanted to do this, and I enjoy the work. Of course, there was a lot of controversy about the people, whether they would come back or whether they wouldn't, and that sort of thing. But, well, I think it's good that there is a little more attention to the system. I think the system's in a rebuilding program now, and it's going to be a lot better, probably because of what's happened, because of the strike and the new people. I'm sorry the old people aren't here. I'm sorry anybody would lose a job, but I'm glad to be here and I enjoy it a lot.
The facility chief at Danley says the controller's walkout and firing never had much of an effect here anyway. He says the low volume of air traffic makes it easy for a limited number of controllers to handle the situation. There are 4 regular controllers at Danley and 2 military controllers who were brought in shortly after the walkout. Now, as more of the trainees step up into full controller positions, tower officials say the military controllers will be leaving soon. Reporting from Danley Field, Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News.
In St. Charles, Missouri, Harold Cochran, an atomic veteran, is afraid that the low-level radiation to which he was exposed might someday kill him.
It's been
living hell almost. I've been afraid to go to the doctor. I'm afraid of what they'll say.
Cochran participated in 17 nuclear blasts in the Pacific Marshall Islands. He had been a Navy machinist. In 1956, aboard the USS George Eastman, he worked with Atomic Energy Commission scientists. After the blasts, they would steam through Ground Zero, following the mushroom cloud, taking measurements and readings. He believes that aboard ship, he was exposed to radiation that led to his deteriorating health today. All this time, what did the Navy tell you about the possible effects of radiation on you, on your health?
Absolutely nothing. Not a bit. Not a thing. I was never contacted after I got out about it or anything.
Cochran feels betrayed and says it's typical GI catch-22. Under the rules, to receive compensation, a man must make his claim within 1 year after leaving the service. But diseases, like cancer, can take many years to develop. With no medical follow-up, with records hard to find, it's become nearly impossible for men who took part in the tests to prove any relationship between radiation exposure and their diseases.
From what I can understand right now, the government is taking a stand that, hey, it's not our fault. Prove to me that radiation exposure is what caused your problem.
Officials at the Veterans Administration headquarters here in Washington, D.C. prefer to minimize the delayed effects of low-level radiation. Why? The lack of hard evidence.
There has been continuing, ongoing investigation by the medical people into this area, and they just have not been able to come up with any sound conclusions at this time.
John Hagan of the Veterans Administration says atomic vets are treated, although he says less than 3% have been granted disability benefits. Mr. Hagan, essentially, isn't the Veterans Administration really in the driver's seat here, and the veteran is behind the 8 ball?
No, the Veterans Administration isn't in the driver's seat. We are an agency of law and regulations, and we have to abide by the law and the regulation.
After vets started questioning the delayed effects of radiation exposure, what it might do to their health, the government started asking vets, like Harold Cochran, to call in and have their information put into computers. He contacted the Defense Nuclear Agency in Washington, explained what tests he was in, what the state of his health is like. Colonel Dale Keller is spokesman for the DNA. With the information that you're gathering, are you telling these veterans that they could possibly have ill effects as a result of low-level radiation exposure? Yes or no?
To answer the question, I think it's important that you understand that to date, there has been no ill effect to health noted from exposure to low levels of ionizing radiation from the atmospheric testing.
So you're saying nothing to them about that?
And if you look at the statistics, certainly we send them a fact sheet that tells what our nuclear test personnel review program is. And included
what did the Defense Nuclear Agency tell you in that letter about possible ill effects of your participation in those tests?
Nothing. It said until we've got more information, there's absolutely nothing, no warning at all in it.
And that letter is dated when?
It's dated May the 18th, 1978.
Have you heard from the Defense Nuclear Agency since then?
No, sir. Not at all.
Harold Cochran wonders if he'll ever hear from the government again. On the wall here in the Veterans Administration headquarters building in Washington, D.C., are the words of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln said, "We must care for those who have borne the battle and for their widows and orphans." Atomic veterans, nearly 250,000 of them, left the Cold War battlefields years ago. Today, they say their bodies are suffering from the delayed effects of radiation exposure. They're angry because the Veterans Administration considers their ailments a scientific unknown. Thus, disability claims are denied. So soldiers and widows are left to fight for benefits. O.T. Weeks of Alabama is an atomic veteran fighting for benefits. Pat Brody of California is the widow of an atomic veteran fighting for benefits. She recently won a major court decision. The court ruled the government may be liable for not warning her husband about radiation's potential effects. But there's more litigation ahead for her. Weeks has lost 3 appeals with the VA for disability claims.
I made my mind up from the beginning to get in it, fight it, or get out of it, to prove that right is right and wrong is wrong.
What drives me? I don't know.
He can't come back.
He can't come back. I know that. And money can't buy happiness. I want the government to pay for his death.
We're really here to kick off what we choose to call the largest manhunt in history.
Recently in Las Vegas, the National Association of Atomic Veterans met. It searches for A-bomb soldiers. It wants them to know about potential health disorders since the government is reluctant to tell them.
Our problems are pretty complex because the VA is set up to make determinations based on wartime injuries, you know, firefight type things. Our problems begin after some latency period. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no question but what the government should have, in fact, followed those guys up to see what their continuing health pattern might be.
In Washington, Dr. Lawrence Hobson of the Veterans Administration believes some earlier scientific conclusions on low-level radiation could be challenged.
What can low-level radiation do to a person?
We're not even certain as to exactly what it will do even today.
Why not?
Because the effects are going to be quite subtle. They may be difficult to detect. They may be quite unusual. Frankly, I do not believe that we should give any kind of final judgment until we really know. And at present, we don't. I think the thing is still an open question.
The battlefield of the future, if it exists, may well be an atomic battlefield. That brutal fact has forced upon the Army the absolute necessity of testing both men and technical concepts under atomic conditions.
We were, no question about it, used as guinea pigs.
It was very unsafe because there was no precautions taken.
It's a very sad, grim legacy of nuclear weapons testing that those of us who are left must tell this story.
With claims difficult to prove, atomic veterans believe their best hope for compensation will come through legislation passed by Congress. At best, that will take years. Meantime, atomic veterans who are ill say their time is running out.
Authorities say the robbery suspect, while driving from the restaurant, fired a shot at a detective car, just missing the driver. Police chased Duhart down the interstate, reaching speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. The chase ended when the suspect wrecked his car at Park Place and Mulberry Street. Police say Duhart, who was armed with a shotgun and a .38 caliber pistol, fired several more shots at detectives who chased him. Then he fled into a field in back of some houses on Hampton Street. Major E.B. Alford, chief of detectives for the Montgomery Police Department, says Duhart then fired again at two canine officers who were searching for him in back of the houses.
When they spotted him in the field, he was armed with a sawed-off shotgun and a handgun. He began to fire on the officers and was given every opportunity to surrender peacefully. He refused to do so, sent out several challenges to the police officers to come on in and get him if they thought they could. And at that time, we tried to work in, get close enough to the guy to surround him, maybe get him to surrender. He continued to fire at the officers, and the officers returned the fire, and the subject was struck multiple times.
Duhart was treated on the scene and then rushed to Jackson Hospital, where he spent the better part of this morning in surgery. Major Alford says the money taken in the robbery was found in a trick-or-treat bag in back of the car driven by Duhart, and several more shotgun shells were recovered from the front floorboard of the car. Police say although Duhart has a Montgomery address, they believe he's from Michigan. He reportedly told police following the shooting he was just released from prison 2 months ago. Alford says police are lucky that not a single officer was wounded in the exchange of gunfire.
Police Sergeant V.H. Hicks says there have been fewer reported rapes in Montgomery this year. There were more than 70 reports in 1981 and 23 so far in 1982. But the department's arrest rate doesn't look as good as last year. Detective Hicks hopes that will change shortly. Hicks says police have a suspect in a series of rapes in southwest Montgomery. 5 rapes occurred in the South Lawn area from February until last week.
The ones that we worked on from South Lawn,
were burglary type rapes where the subject would enter someone's home. In this case, we had a subject that was entering the home of a female alone. Before she got home, he was casing the houses to know when they were coming home and expect them. He would break in and wait on them to come home before he would commit the rape.
Hicks says an arrest has been made in one of those rapes. To make that arrest, police relied on reports of suspicious persons in the neighborhood. So Hicks says protection can boil down to watching out for your neighbor. Susan Silvernail, WSFA TV News.
We've had
The fire raged out of control for over an hour. Fire officials say the blaze spread quickly from Cox Car Care Center to Capital Glass and Trim due to paint and paint thinners stored in the car care center. 2 firemen were slightly injured when a wall fell into the street. Other firemen suffered from heat, but there were no serious injuries. Firefighters could do little more than contain the blaze to keep it from spreading to a gas station and other surroundings.